What's an NSFW fact about history that we don't get to hear too often? Story 1. There is a legal penis size in Iceland. It's an old law from the Middle Ages after a woman was married off to a man, and on her wedding night was so disappointed with how small his penis was that she took him back to the church to have an annulment. Because of her, a law was made that a man must be at least 3 inches while hard to marry. There is a wonderful documentary called The Final Member in which this is an actual problem. Story 2. There is a carving on the side of the belfry in Ghent that depicts a man suckling the breast of a woman. The story is that the man was condemned to die unless he could prove his innocence by surviving imprisonment without food for 40 days. He could have visitors during his imprisonment, but they of course were checked for food. His daughter visited him every day. She was a wet nurse. He was let go after 40 days having survived. Story 3. In ancient Egypt, soldiers proved their battle prowess by presenting the severed penises of their slaughtered enemies. Traditionally, severed hands were presented, but in 1182 BC, Libyans and other allies invaded Egypt and were defeated by the army of Rameses III, and Rameses suspected that some soldiers were claiming extra credit by presenting the hands of women as well as the male soldiers. So he demanded penises instead. His victory inscriptions mention 12,535 foreskins and hands, and has images of the piles of the body parts at the Medinet Habu mortuary temple. Story 4. Shi Peipu was a Chinese opera singer turned spy active during the 1960s. He pretended to be a woman for 20 years to seduce a French embassy employee and obtain classified documents. His charade went so far as to fake a pregnancy and purchase a child and pretend it was this. He managed to fool everyone, including his lover, for over 2 decades before finally being exposed to the world. Edit. The rest of the story. Apparently, it caused a massive uproar in French media. Like, how could this possibly happen? The diplomat, Boursiquot, tried to slit his own throat, but failed. Both were tried, found guilty and imprisoned for espionage, but they were soon released because the leaked documents were not all that important. Shi Peipu returned to being an opera singer in Paris, enjoying his notoriety to gain fame, before dying in 2009 at the age of 70. Boursiquot is reportedly still alive in a nursing home in Brittany, and their son is living in Paris with his family. Story 5. Back during the Age of Sail, sailors would go months and months without any women or any privacy. When they'd get to port, hundreds of prostitutes would take boats out to the ships to greet the sailors, who would almost all have shreks with at least one. This included the ship's boys. Like I said, there was no privacy at all. The crew would share one huge room, dozens or hundreds of men sleeping in hammocks slung 28 inches apart. So the ensuing copulation took place in the wide open. Hundreds of people having shreks all over the ship in plain sight. This wasn't a rare thing. It was almost universal, though some more religious captains wouldn't let the prostitutes on board. STDs were therefore incredibly common. Side point. British sailors got a full ration of rum equal to 8 shots every day. If they were not long out of port, they got a full gallon of beer daily. When people complain about moral decay of society, it really just means to me that they don't know about history. Society is quite chaste today compared to much of the past. Story 6. Machiavelli wrote a letter to his friend about how he ducked a prostitute, then threw up all over her when the lights came on. Because she was so ugly, I was now completely terrified. However, since I was alone with her in the dark, I gave her a good hump. Even though I found her thighs flabby, her genitals greasy and her breath stinking a bit, my lust was so desperate that I went ahead and gave it to her anyway. When their liaison was over, Machiavelli managed to find a lamp and was able to shine a light on the woman. My god, she was so ugly that I almost dropped dead. A tuft of hair, half white and half black. The top of her head was bald, which allowed you to see several lice taking a stroll. Her eyebrows were full of nits, one eye looked down and the other up. Her tear ducts were full of mucus, her nose was twisted into a peculiar shape, the nostrils were full of snot, and one of them was half missing. Her mouth looked like Lorenzo de Medicis, twisted on one side and drooling since she had no teeth to keep the saliva in her mouth. Her lip was covered with a thin but rather long moustache. When the woman spoke to him, Machiavelli was struck by her stinking breath, and I heaved so much that I vomited all over her. Story 7. At the temple of Aphrodite in Cyprus, overlooking the legendary birthplace of Aphrodite, young virgin girls would tie a bowstring around their head and await a man to come along and throw a silver coin of any value into their lap. The man would say, "I demand thee in the name of the goddess." The girl then had to have sex with the man. In this way the girl would make her first fruit offering to Aphrodite. It is said that some girls had to come back for many days before they were chosen. Story 8. Zhang Zhanchang, a Chinese warlord dubbed by Time as China's basest warlord, was nicknamed Old 86, which referred to either his height or the length of his penis, which was rumored to be as long as 86 Mexican silver dollars stacked together. He was also a poet. Case in point, you tell me to do this, he tells me to do that. You're all bastards, go duck your mother. Poem about bastards by Zhang Zhanchang. There was also this one time during a famine where he visited a temple and, instead of praying and offering gifts, slapped the temple statue and said, "Duck your sister. How dare you make Shandong's people suffer by not giving us rain." Then proceeded to order his artillery to shoot into the sky until it rained. It rained the next day. Story 9. From the 13th to the 15th of February the Romans celebrated Lupercalia, Roman precursor of Valentine's Day, which was a festival of love and fertility. Priests would sacrifice a goat and then cut the goat skin into pieces. Part of this they would wear on their heads and other parts were cut into thongs. The men would then run around the city of Rome naked, hitting as many women with these thongs as they possibly could. Being hid would help with pregnancy or becoming pregnant. So depending on what they wanted, the women would either deliberately stand in the way of the men or try to run away, while pretty much everyone was naked. In another part of the festivities men would draw names of women from a jar and the goal was that they'd stay together for the duration of the festival. This would often result in a lot of, intercourse, and sometimes people actually fell in love and got married after they met during Lupercalia. Story 10. There was a guy that tried to prove that yellow fever wasn't contagious, and so he would pour the infected vomit into his freshly cut open wound, pouring it into his eyes, and drinking it, and soaking into a bath of it, and smearing his body with blood, pus, and spit. He was fine, because yellow fever isn't spread through direct contact, it's spread through mosquitoes. So he did all that for nothing. His name was Stubbinsworth, look it up. Story 11. French modern philosopher Michel Foucault, in addition to studying crime and deviance in a criminology sense, also applied his theories on punishment to his fascination with BDSM, having also written a number of kink-based works. He eventually moved to San Francisco and partook in gay bathhouses, notorious for casual shreks. He eventually caught HIV and some have speculated, it may be written somewhere, that he purposely contracted it as some sort of poetic social commentary. Oddly, I learned this stuff while getting my administration of justice major and studying corrections, lol. Story 12. You know that one psychologist guy, Freud? Well, one time he was tasked with finding the testicles of an eel, so he got literally hundreds of eels, so he could find their balls. Nowadays we know eels have retractable testicles, but Freud didn't know that, so he cut up hundreds of eels looking for their testicles. Story 13. Pope Alexander VI might have held orgies where he kept track of men's orgasms while he held the position of pope, and also definitely had an infidelity fetish, especially with women whose wedding he'd officiated. He had 4 kids with one married noblewoman and at least another 3 to 5 outside of that. Story 14. Not sure if anyone else mentioned it, but when at a Salvador Dalí museum, they mentioned that he had a shit fetish. He was alienated from a lot of the modernist movement and even kicked out of some art society he in. And I'm not talking anal, I'm talking literal 2 girls 1 cup fecal stuff, lol. Edit. To those who keep commenting on his expulsion because of his touting of fascism, yes, that was a factor as well. What is it that people endlessly warm to in a man who once suggested that the deepest way to demonstrate one's love for another is to eat their excrement? For Dalí, such vulgarity was not an occasional slip of a sleazy tongue, but a job description. This is an artist who said he enjoyed hearing of transport disasters, who openly applauded Franco's fascism and frequently congratulated the dictator on his political tortures and assassinations, who once chortled that sometimes I spit on the portrait of my mother for the sheer pleasure of it. Story 15. 1984. During the Iraq/Iran war, Iraqi forces had laid hundreds of exposed electrical wires in the Majnoon marshes which they knew the Iranians had to cross. Those wires were all snaked together and connected to large electrical generators. When Iran attempted to cross the marsh with boats, Iraq used just enough concentrated artillery to force the Iran soldiers out of the boats and walk through the marshland. As soon as that happened, the Iraqis fired up their generators and electrocuted thousands of Iranian soldiers in an instant. That's not the worst part. The Iraqis then sent in a road building detail and collected all of the Iranian dead and stacked the bodies like cordwood, 5 corpses high and 5 across, covering them with lime and then a bunch of sand. They used the Iranian dead to build a road for their trucks to cross the marshlands. The sheer hatred, madness, and precision needed to pull this operation off, as well as carry it through, is just horrific to think about. Story 16. May have already been said, there are thousands of comments, but Pope Alexander VI threw a party that is referred to today as the Joust of Whores. He had a large number of women attend a banquet he was throwing, get naked, and would scramble to pick up chestnuts that the Pope and other people at the party threw at them. This party was followed by Alexander holding a contest to see who could sleep with the most women by the end of the night. During the whole thing his kids were also present. Alexander also liked watching his horses breed and would arrange for upwards of 100 horses put outside his palace so he could watch them for hours. Story 17. In ancient Greece, many city-states had these landmark/mile marking/good luck statues called Hermie, which consisted of a bust of a god's head and, for some inscrutable reason, an erect phallus at its midsection. In 415 BC, someone mutilated the Hermie of Athens in exactly the way you'd expect. Athenians were outraged, initially accusing their enemies, the Spartans, of de-dunging the deities, then deducing that it was drunken revelers, before blaming Alcibiades as the Nobnabber. Alcibiades was an Athenian statesman and military leader famous for being Socrates' boy lover, as well as having a rather rowdy reputation. He's depicted, in Plato's Socratic works, as being frequently shit-faced and giving long and rambling, yet very articulate, "I love you, man," speeches. It frankly just seemed like the sort of thing Alcibiades and his brothers might do. And he also had a lot of petty political enemies. Alcibiades strenuously denied the accusations of willy whacking and offered to stand trial immediately to defend himself. Athens, however, decided to wait until after he had left for a military expedition to try him in absentia, condemn him to death, and order him to return home to die. Alcibiades chose instead to defect to Athens' enemy, Sparta. This was during the Peloponnesian War against Sparta, and right on the eve of the Sicilian expedition which Alcibiades had planned. Unsurprisingly, the expedition was an unmitigated disaster for Athens, and arguably led to their defeat in the war. Alcibiades, on the other hand, served Sparta for a time, only to defect to Persia after he had been caught sleeping with the king's wife, and then, years later, convinced Athens to take him back and clear him of any charges. Story 18. There are disputed claims that both Napoleon's and Rasputin's members were, well, dismembered during their respective autopsies and have traveled the world extensively, possibly farther than either men ever did, as well as being shown in multiple occasions to the public. On a similar note, it is well known LBJ had a massive Johnson, and Rasputin's Jerthy Sklang was venerated amongst high-class women of his time. No wonder he's indeed Russia's greatest love machine. Story 19. Victor Hugo, the guy who wrote, among other things, Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, was a Shrek's addict. He claimed he and his wife had Shreks 9 times on their wedding night. When she got bored with this, and I don't blame her for that, it just all sounds way too much, he proceeded to go and bang everyone and everything that caught his eye. When he died, the brothels in Paris were closed down for the day so all the prostitutes could go and pay their respects to him. Fittingly, Paris apparently experienced a mini baby boom 9 months after his funeral, which 2 million people attended. Story 20. Not to NSFW, but a fun story regardless. In ancient Egypt around 570 BC, the situation for the Egyptian empire is growing more and more grim. The current pharaoh Apis kept on losing important battles to the other expanding kingdoms and empires around Egypt. The population thus grew more and more discontent with his god status and started to lose faith in his ability to reign the country. Slowly but surely a group of usurpers started gathering numbers to eventually overthrow Apries. As an answer to this, he sent one of his best generals, Amasis, to beat down the potential rebellion before it would even break out. However, upon arrival Amasis was convinced to join the cause of the rebellion. After not having heard back from his general in a while, Apries decided to inquire a bit further and eventually found out that Amasis had crossed him. Furious, he sent out a messenger to retrieve Amasis, who, in the meantime, had been elected the rebellion's leader. When the messenger, Ptolemus, arrived, this scenario played out. When Ptolemus came and summoned Amasis, Amasis, sitting on horseback, raised his leg and farted, telling the messenger to take that back to Apries. He went on to successfully dethrone Apries and became known as the last of the great kings of the late dynasty. Story 21. Before the widespread availability of abortion, mothers would often choose between infanticide, poison in the nipple, intentional smothering in bed, or burying alive for instance, or abandoning the infant either in the woods or in public. This was generally less to hide indiscretions and more, because they already had too many mouths to feed. Abandoning the child was considered to be the more guilt-free option. A mother who left their baby in the woods could comfort herself with the thought that maybe a woodsman found and decided to raise the child, for instance, although it almost certainly suffered and died of exposure. They could pretend for the rest of their life that their child was just fine out there somewhere. Men invented cages to go over a sleeping baby to prevent the mother rolling over, and were surprised to learn this didn't help because so few cases were actually accidental. An interesting alternative popped up, which was foundling homes, which first came about in Italy during the Renaissance. This offered a tempting alternative to abandoning a child in nature. This was a home. However, it was an open secret that this option usually meant death. There weren't enough wet nurses to go around, and no formula meant that the death rate of these abandoned infants was above 90%. This was an open secret. Mothers knew the babies placed here would probably die, but it allowed them to ease their own conscience. The amount of babies abandoned per year in one foundling home in one city in Italy was in the thousands per year. Before these homes, it wouldn't be uncommon to find dead infants in trash heaps, on the street, or in a river, and the foundling homes did decrease this, but increased abandonment altogether. Some mothers even began abandoning their infants specifically to be hired into the foundling home as a wet nurse. The pay was too tempting. Keep in mind this was still the case well into the 1800s. Story 22. Female hair grooming is not a modern thing. Ancient Egyptians were removing their pubic hair. So were noble ladies in medieval France, among many other societies. Edit, including Rome and ancient Greece for the higher up in society, 18th century French waxing parlors, and that some form of body hair trimming for both men and women is advised for those of the Islamic faith. There is even an anecdote. This is half remembered, and I can't find a source, so please if someone can confirm what source, of a married French noblewoman insulting a knight for not being able to grow a beard, and that he must be a bad lover. The knight asked whether she had pubic hair. She confirmed that she did not, the fashion at the time. He then asked if she was a maiden. She replied that she was a married woman and adequately fulfilled her duties to her husband. The knight then replied that they must be as good lovers as each other, and the whole court, including the lady, burst out laughing at his mostly beardless face, and she apologized to him. I guess the reason that I commented is that whether driven by societal pressure, peer pressure from women to look pretty or men to look Shrexy, this is a recurring theme in history, and that people should not be judged for their choices either way, and should do what makes them feel happy. Story 23. Drukpa Kunli, the Buddhist missionary into Bhutan, and one of the country's most famous historical figures, was famous for enlightening women with his dick. He was known for his crazy methods of enlightening other beings, mostly women, which earned him the title the Saint of 5,000 Women. Among other things, women would seek his blessing in the form of shreks. His intention was to show that it is possible to be enlightened, impart enlightenment, and still lead a very healthy Shrek's life. Because of this power to awaken unenlightened beings, Kunli's penis is referred to as the thunderbolt of flaming wisdom, and he himself is known as the fertility saint. For this reason women from all around the world visited his monastery to seek his blessing. Some of his most famous performances include urinating on sacred thankas, stripping down naked, or offering his testicles to a famous lama. He is one of very few Buddhist teachers to almost always appear in Bhutanese paintings topless. It is known that Drukpa would not bless anyone who came to seek his guidance and help unless they brought a beautiful woman and a bottle of wine. His fertility temple, Chamilakhang, is today filled with the weaved portable wine bottles. Story 24. Catherine the Great is rumored to have died of having Shreks with a horse. This is untrue. She had a stroke on the toilet like a normal person. She did however have, well, quite the appetite, let's just say. She took a pretty long series of lovers and loved Shreks so much she had a bunch of pretty raunchy furniture made. She liked herself some dick and some of the stuff she had made was extremely X-rated. She also gave no shits about status when it came to her men and would gladly boink a peasant if she met a low status dude that struck her fancy. All told, this was also a pretty good deal for anybody who she fancied. She'd usually elevate the guy to the nobility and set him up financially. She would of course eventually get bored of her lovers, but also didn't really hold any malice toward exes. It usually ended with what amounted to nothing personal: I'm just tired of you, have some land and money then go away. Her rule is considered a Russian golden age and life got better for absolutely everybody in Russia at the time. Generally when history covers her, it covers her long successful rule and not her shameless love of cock. Story 25. Kaiser Wilhelm was obsessed with his mother and very specifically her hands. I have been dreaming about your dear soft warm hands. I'm awaiting with impatience the time when I can sit near you and kiss them. But pray keep your promise you gave me always to give me alone the soft inside of your hand to kiss. But of course you keep this as a secret for yourself. In another letter, he tells her, I have again dreamt about you. This time I was alone with you in your library when you stretched forth your arms and pulled me down. Then you took off your gloves and laid your hand gently on my lips for me to kiss it. I wish you would do the same when I'm in Berlin alone with you in the evening. The contents of the correspondence will be revealed in a new documentary, Queen Victoria and the Crippled Kaiser, on Channel 4 tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. Dr. Brett Carr, a psychologist and trustee of the Freud Museum, said, Wilhelm is devoting his Shrektial energies to his mother, and in particular to part of his mother's body, her very beautiful hands. So I think he's using his mother as a way of testing out these burgeoning erotic feelings in a way that almost borders on the incestuous. His mother did not respond in kind. Instead she chose to correct her son's grammar, and Wilhelm became bitter towards her and her country. His hatred worsened in 1888 when a British doctor unsuccessfully attempted to treat his father, the Kaiser Friedrich, for throat cancer, prompting the outburst, an English doctor crippled my arm and an English doctor is killing my father. While Kaiser Wilhelm II attended Queen Victoria's funeral in 1901, barely a decade later Britain and Germany were at war. But by 1918, the Kaiser had fallen from grace, living in exile in the Netherlands, where he died in 1941. Story 26. The Japanese soldiers who are sent across Asia used to round up able-bodied Chinese men to shoot and kill in an effort to stop the Chinese from revolting and to prove that they were superior to the Chinese. Most of the people who are killed in the colonies were Chinese, all to prove they were superior. In fact, their methods were so brutal that literal Nazis told them that they were going overkill. Story 27. More not school friendly than NSFW, but we learn the merry legend of Johnny Appleseed, who wandered around planting apple seeds wherever he went, so apple trees would grow cause he loved apples so much. In reality, Johnny lived on the frontier and was pretty good about knowing where future settlements would crop up further west down the Ohio. He'd get there ahead of time, plant apple seeds to start a nursery of apple trees, fence it in, and come back and tend it now and then. When people showed up, he would hire one of them to watch and tend the orchard for him and sell the apple trees to new settlers, stopping by occasionally to make sure everything was okay and get his cut of the money. The big thing they don't tell you in school is that apples that come from trees grown from seeds don't taste good. If an apple tree produces apples that taste good, at least back then, you grafted a piece of the tree into the ground to clone a new tree, not plant its seeds. So John is usually probably tasted like shit. That didn't matter, however, because mostly what settlers wanted was apples to ferment into booze. Yep, Johnny planted apples so people could get liquored up. But you try telling truths like that to first graders and the school board suddenly gets all up in arms about promoting drinking and handing out apple mash to kids, and oh my god, Mr. Don't PM me breasts. You're drunk right now, aren't you? Not my fault that Billy couldn't hold his booze. And I'll be damned if I'm going to teach lies to kids just cause the man tells me I can't drink moonshine during planning period. Story 28. Canadians were very brutal towards the Germans during the First World War. They exploited the trust out of them by throwing cans of meat in their trenches. When the Germans asked for more, they threw hand grenades instead. They were also known for killing the wounded and surrendered Germans. One case had a Canadian soldier slipping a live grenade into a German POW, killing him. They also were the most enthusiastic users of poison gas on the Western Front. They pretty much gassed anything that moved if they had the chance. Some estimates at 1.90% of the gas attacks were caused by Canadians. During night trench raids, Canadian would make their faces black, wore thick dark gloves, and use meat cleaver, push daggers, trench clubs with nails embedded, and other homemade weapons on the Germans. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more daily videos.